He found her in a mule cart at the edge of his land, the woman he'd buried 3 years ago. The sun was bleeding out over the hills, painting the sky in shades of rust and warning. Elias Boone had been riding the fence line since dawn, the silence of the prairie his only companion. Then he saw it, a cart, still as a corpse, just sitting there. No horse, no driver, no tracks. It was as if the earth itself had coughed it up. His hand went to the revolver on his hip, a habit as natural as breathing out here. The air was thick, heavy. He wasn't alone. He knew it in his bones. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching on the dry soil, and walked toward the cart. 2 burlap sacks lay tied down in the back. Lumpy, misshapen things. One was long, about the size of a man. The other was smaller, rounder. Flies buzzed a lazy, hungry circle around them. A sick, sweet smell hung in the air, the smell of old blood and fear. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was wrong, all kinds of wrong. He stood there for a long moment, just listening to the wind whisper through the tall grass. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a dry, rasping whisper, like dead leaves skittering across stone. Please. The voice was barely human. It wasn't a plea. It was just a fact, a statement of need from a place beyond hope. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled out his knife, the steel glinting in the dying light, and moved toward the larger sack. The twine was thick, tied in tight, angry knots. He sawed at it, his knuckles white. The fibers gave way one by one, each snap echoing in the unnerving quiet. The sack fell open. Dust and the smell of rot billowed out. And then a face he knew better than his own reflection in a still pond. Gaunt, cracked, and caked with dirt. But it was hers. The high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw, the scar above her right eyebrow, a tiny white crescent from the time she tried to ride that wild bull calf on a dare. Clara, his wife, his dead wife. She stared up at him, her eyes vacant, 2 hollowed-out pits of exhaustion. Her lips were split and dry, a smear of dried blood on her cheek like a cruel mockery of war paint. Her wrists were bound with a frayed rope, the skin beneath rubbed raw and bloody. She tried to sit up, a rattling cough shaking her frail body, and she nearly tumbled out of the cart. Elias lunged forward, catching her without a thought, his arms wrapped around a skeleton. The woman who used to feel so strong and vital in his embrace was now nothing but sharp angles and brittle bones. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The world tilted on its axis, and 3 years of carefully constructed grief crumbled into dust. Her laugh in the barn, the scent of rosemary in her hair, the way she'd hum a tuneless little song while mending his shirts. All of it rushed back, a tidal wave of memory that threatened to drown him. This wasn't the Clara he remembered. This was the ghost of her, a woman who had been dragged through hell and left for dead on his doorstep. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. He leaned closer, his ear almost touching her face. "You didn't know?" she rasped. No, he didn't know. 3 years. 3 years they'd told him she was gone. A raiding party, they'd said. Her horse was found miles away, half dead and bleeding. No body, no ransom note. Just gone. The town sheriff, Alton Graves, had clapped him on the shoulder and said some women just aren't cut out for this life. A few folks whispered she'd run off with a traveling peddler. He'd nearly broken a man's jaw for saying it. He'd held a funeral. He'd put a stone in the ground with her name on it. He'd mourned her. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed nothing. He carried her toward the house, each step feeling like he was wading through a bad dream. The house was a museum of their life together. Her shawl was still draped over the rocking chair. Her sewing basket sat by the hearth, a half-finished quilt still threaded on the needle. He had lived in a tomb of his own making, and now a ghost had come home to haunt it. He laid her down on their bed, the bed they had built together from pine wood and promises. He pulled the quilt up to her chin, his hands trembling. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. And just as the last bit of light faded from the sky, Elias heard the sound of an approaching horse. He stepped onto the porch, his hand once again on his gun, and watched as Sheriff Alton Graves reined in his horse. Dust swirled around the man's boots, following him like a faithful hound. Graves didn't dismount right away. He just sat there in his saddle, his face hidden in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Heard you found something, Boone," the sheriff said. His voice was tight, stretched thin like old leather. It was a voice that held too much knowledge and not enough surprise. "She's alive," Elias said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "So I heard." A long, heavy pause settled between them, a pause long enough for a lie to take root and grow. "She say where she's been?" "No." Elias's voice was flat, giving nothing away. He didn't trust the look in the sheriff's unseen eyes. He didn't trust the way the man held himself, coiled and ready. "Man who found the cart said he saw it just west of the canyon fork," Graves continued, his tone casual, too casual. "Same area that Mallister boy went missing last fall. She's a lucky woman." "She ain't lucky," Elias growled. "She's stubborn." Graves finally swung down from his horse. He didn't move any closer. "You plan on keeping her here?" The question was a slap in the face. Where else would she go? This is her home. The sheriff shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "Folks talk, Elias. 3 years is a long time. Stories get told. Minds get made up." He glanced toward the house, toward the window where a faint flicker of movement suggested Clara was watching them. You tell her she can come down to the jailhouse. Give a statement, if she wants to." The emphasis on that last part was heavy. "Or maybe," Graves said, turning back to his horse, "maybe she just wants to forget." He rode off without another word, leaving Elias standing in the deepening twilight with a cold dread coiling in his stomach. The sheriff hadn't been offering help. He'd been delivering a warning. Elias went back inside. Clara was lying still, her eyes open, tracking the shadows that crawled along the ceiling. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under his weight. He didn't know what to say. What words could possibly bridge the chasm of 3 years of hell? She spoke first, her voice a dry rustle. "They left me. For dead," he finished for her. "They said nobody would come looking," she whispered, her eyes fixed on something far away. "Said no one cares about a rancher's wife who never gave him a son." The words were a knife in his gut. He swallowed the bitter taste of bile that rose in his throat. He hated that she had to say it. He hated the part of him, the small, ugly part, that wished she hadn't. She must have seen the storm in his face because her next words were sharp, forged in fire. "I don't want your pity, Elias." He looked at her then, at the unbroken spirit burning in those haunted eyes. "You don't have my pity," he said, his voice raw. "You have my fire." For the first time since he'd found her, a flicker of the old Clara returned. Her lips curved into a faint ghost of a smile, and she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in something that looked almost like peace. He knew right then and there, this wasn't just about her survival. This was about vengeance, and it was just getting started. But as he stood to leave the room, his eyes fell on the second burlap sack, the one he'd left tied in the cart. He had been so focused on Clara, he'd completely forgotten about it. A sudden, chilling thought struck him. What else had they left for him to find? He walked back out into the cool night air, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. The cart sat where he'd left it, a dark shape against the starry sky. He approached it slowly, a sense of foreboding settling over him like a shroud. He reached into the back and his fingers brushed against the rough burlap of the second sack. It was smaller than the first, but heavy, solid. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers clumsy with a dread he couldn't name. The knot came undone. He pulled the sack open. It wasn't feed. It wasn't supplies. It was a collection of objects, a gruesome pile of stolen memories. A small, hand-carved wooden horse, just like the one his son Jonah had been working on before the fever took him. A silver locket, tarnished and bent, with a faded picture of a woman he didn't recognize. A child's worn leather shoe. And at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. His blood ran cold. He knew that journal. It belonged to the Mallister boy, the one Sheriff Graves had mentioned, the one who had disappeared without a trace last fall. Elias opened it, his hands shaking. The pages were filled with the boy's neat, careful script. detailing his journey west. The last entry was dated nearly a year ago. The ink was smeared as if written in a hurry. They promised passage. They lied. It's not a guide service. It's a trap. D. Marlowe is his name. He has the devil's own eyes. They took everything. If anyone finds this, tell my mother I... The entry ended there, a frantic, unfinished scrawl. D. Marlowe. The name echoed in the silence of the prairie. This wasn't a random raid. This wasn't a simple kidnapping. This was something organized, something methodical and evil. And Clara had been in the heart of it for 3 long years. The cart, the sacks. It wasn't a rescue. It was a message, a taunt. We had her, we have others, and we can come back whenever we want. He looked up at the house, at the single lamp burning in the window of his bedroom where Clara lay. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a witness. And the men who had taken her, the men who had left this horrific calling card, knew it. The sheriff's visit suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. His casual mention of the Mallister boy, his suggestion that Clara might want to forget. Graves wasn't trying to keep the peace. He was trying to bury the truth. Was he just a coward? Or was he something worse? Was he involved? The thought hit Elias like a physical blow. The law in this town wasn't here to protect them. It was here to protect them. The monsters who lurked in the canyons and preyed on the innocent. He and Clara weren't just facing a few ruthless outlaws. They were facing a conspiracy that went all the way to the man wearing the badge. They were utterly, completely alone, and the hunters were on their way. The next few days passed in a tense, suffocating silence. Clara drifted through the house like a phantom, her movements slow and deliberate. She'd clean a window pane until it gleamed, then stand and stare out at the empty horizon for an hour. She'd pick up her sewing needle, stitch a perfect line, then set it down and walk away, leaving the thread hanging. She was a woman retracing the steps of a life that no longer felt like her own, searching for a ghost in her own home. Elias watched her, his heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her she was safe. But the words felt like lies. They weren't safe, and the woman in his house was a stranger forged in a fire he couldn't possibly imagine. He saw the way she startled at every creak of the floorboards, the way her eyes darted to the windows whenever a shadow passed. She was a caged animal, even in her own home. He cooked for her, simple meals of beans and biscuits. He'd leave a plate by the bed, and hours later he'd find it untouched. He heard her cry only once, a small, muffled sound from the porch in the dead of night. He sat in his chair by the cold hearth, the Mallister boy's journal heavy in his lap, and listened until the sound stopped, feeling more helpless than he ever had in his life. On the 3rd morning, she tried to walk to the kitchen on her own. Her legs, weak from disuse, gave out from under her. Elias was there in an instant, catching her before she hit the floor. Her body was stiff in his arms. She didn't thank him. She just pushed herself upright, her jaw set in a line of grim determination, and leaned against the wall, taking one shaky step after another. They didn't need words. Their silence was a language of its own, a shared space filled with unspoken pain and a terrifying, uncertain future. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. He needed an ally, someone he could trust. And in the town of St. Hollow, there was only one man who fit that description. Jedediah Kemp. He saddled his horse and rode into town, the journal tucked securely inside his coat. The town felt different. Or maybe he was the one who was different. He felt the weight of eyes on him as he rode down the main street. Whispers followed him like burrs on a saddle blanket. Ma Redding, the town's foremost gossip, was sweeping the steps of her boarding house. She stopped her work and just stared, her lips a thin, disapproving line. The story of Clara's return had spread like a prairie fire. He found Jed shoeing a horse behind the blacksmith's forge. Jed was a quiet man, his face a roadmap of hard years and honest work. He looked up as Elias approached, his eyes taking in Elias's haggard expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. "Maybe I have," Elias replied. He pulled the journal from his coat. "She's back, Jed. Clara's back." Jed's hammer stilled. He slowly straightened up, wiping a grimy hand across his forehead. His eyes narrowed. "Back from where?" "Hell, by the looks of it." Elias opened the journal and showed him the last frantic entry. He told him everything. The cart, the sacks, the sheriff's veiled warning. Jed read the page, his expression hardening with every word. When he looked up, the usual easy warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard glint. D. Marlowe, he said, the name tasting like poison. I've heard that name before. Whispered, connected to a string of disappearances up near Crooked Ridge. Ranch hands, travelers. They just vanish. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. My wife's cousin, young Thomas. He took a job up at the Crooked Ridge Pass last spring. Supposed to be a cattle drive. He never came back. They found his horse, but no sign of him. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. This was a web, and it had entangled people they knew, people they cared about. What about Graves? Elias asked. Jed spat on the ground. Graves? He's either the most incompetent sheriff in the territory, or he's getting a piece of the action. My money's on the latter. He's got a cousin who rides with a real nasty bunch, always flashing money he ain't earned. So it was true, they were on their own. But as Jed handed the journal back, his hand rested on Elias's shoulder. Not entirely alone, he said, his gaze steady. You have me, and you have her. That woman survived 3 years with those animals. Don't you dare underestimate her. When Elias got back to the ranch, something had shifted. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. He found Clara in the parlor, in front of the old out-of-tune piano. Its keys were yellowed and coated in a thick layer of dust. He hadn't heard music in this house since before she was taken. Her fingers, still thin and shaky, hovered over the keys. Then she pressed one down. A single discordant note hung in the air. She pressed another, then another, picking out a clumsy, halting melody. It was a lullaby, the one she used to hum to their son, Jonah, when he was sick. I wanted to die, she said, her voice soft, her eyes fixed on the piano keys. Every single day, I prayed for it. Elias stood in the doorway, his heart aching. But then I'd remember his face, she whispered, her fingers finding a new note. I'd remember this song, and I knew I couldn't let them have that too. I couldn't let them erase every part of me. She looked up at him then, and for the first time, he saw not a victim, but a fighter, a woman who had clung to a memory, to a simple song, as a weapon against the darkness. She had survived not by luck, but by sheer unyielding will. They're coming back for me, aren't they? She asked. It wasn't a question born of fear. It was a statement of fact. Yes, he said, his voice quiet but firm. They are. Good, she said, a strange, fierce light in her eyes. She turned back to the piano and her fingers, stronger now, began to play the lullaby again, the notes filling the dusty room with a haunting, defiant melody. Let them come. The storm was on its way, but for the first time, Elias Boone realized he wasn't standing next to a fragile ghost. He was standing beside the eye of the hurricane, and hell was coming with her. The days that followed were a strange mixture of quiet domesticity and the tense, coiled energy of a rattlesnake ready to strike. Clara began to eat, small bites at first, then whole plates of food. The hollows in her cheeks started to fill out. Color returned to her skin. She was putting on her armor, rebuilding herself piece by piece. She started working around the house with a feverish intensity. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, polished silver until it gleamed. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control. It was about reclaiming a space that had been violated by her absence. Each chore was an act of defiance, a way of saying, this is mine. You can't have it. Elias found her one afternoon in their son's room. The door had been closed for 3 years. He had never been able to bring himself to open it. But there she was, standing in a shaft of dusty sunlight, a small, worn-out shirt in her hands. Jonah's shirt. He started to say something, to tell her she didn't have to do this. But she spoke first, her back still to him. His fever. It came on so fast, Elias. I know, he said softly. I should have been here. He had been away on a cattle drive, chasing a few extra dollars they didn't really need. The guilt had been his constant companion ever since. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and sharp. The doctor who came, Dr. Albright, He was new to town. He gave Jonah a tincture, said it would bring the fever down. She folded the tiny shirt with meticulous care. The fever got worse after that, much worse. He was gone by morning. A cold dread seeped into Elias's bones. "What are you saying, Clara?" "I'm saying," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that one of the men who held me, he used to brag. He bragged about a doctor on their payroll, a man who could make a sickness look natural, a man who could deliver a message without firing a shot." The floor seemed to drop out from under him. Jonah, their son. It wasn't a random fever. It was a murder, a warning. They had been in his house, in his life, long before they took Clara. They had taken his son as a prelude, a test to see what he would do. And he had done nothing, because he hadn't known. The rage that filled him was so pure, so absolute, it was almost cleansing. It burned away the grief and left only a cold, hard certainty. He would kill them all. Not for revenge, for justice. That night Jed rode out to the ranch, his face grim. "They're moving," he said, dismounting before his horse even came to a full stop. A rancher over on the East Ridge saw them. 3 riders, headed this way, and Elias, one of them was Sheriff Graves's cousin. The pieces were all slotting into place. Graves wasn't just complicit, he was family. They didn't have much time. Elias, Jed, and Clara worked through the night, fortifying the ranch. They boarded up windows, leaving small slits to shoot through. They barricaded the doors with heavy furniture. They loaded every weapon they owned, rifles, shotguns, Elias's old Colt revolver. As he watched Clara expertly check the action on a Winchester rifle, her movements fluid and sure, he was struck by how much she had changed. The woman he had married would have been terrified. This woman was preparing for a war she had been fighting, alone for 3 years. "Where did you learn to handle a rifle like that?" he asked, his voice full of a strange new respect. She didn't look up from her work. "You learn fast when it's the only thing between you and them," she said simply. "They like to hunt, for sport. Sometimes, they used people as the prey. I learned to be a bad target, and a better shot." The casual horror of her words sent a chill down his spine. What other nightmares was she holding inside? What other skills had she been forced to learn in the darkness? Just before dawn, as the first pale light began to streak the eastern sky, they saw them. 3 riders, dark silhouettes against the horizon, moving toward the ranch with a slow, arrogant confidence. They weren't trying to be stealthy. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the fear. Elias took his position at the front window. Jed was in the barn, his rifle resting on a stack of hay bales, giving him a clear line of sight to the side of the house. Clara stood near the back door, her face a mask of cold fury. "Remember the plan," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Let them get close, real close." The riders came to a stop about 50 yards from the house. One of them, a big bearded man with a shotgun resting across his saddle, was Graves's cousin Cole. The man in the middle, tall and wiry with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, laughed. It was a nasty grating sound. "Boone," he shouted, "we know you're in there, and we know you've got our property. Send her out, and we might just let you live." Elias's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He could feel Clara's presence behind him, a silent, burning rage. "She doesn't belong to you!" Elias yelled back, his voice echoing in the morning stillness. The man with the scar spurred his horse forward a few paces. "Oh, she belongs to whoever is strong enough to hold her. And that ain't you, old man. D. Marlowe sends his regards. He's disappointed in her. She took something that wasn't hers to take. A little book, full of names and numbers. He wants it back." The journal. The Mallister boys' journal. That's what this was about. It wasn't just about Clara. It was about the evidence she represented. The evidence that could bring their whole rotten empire crashing down. "You're not getting the book," Clara's voice rang out, clear and strong, from the back of the house. "And you're not getting me." The man with the scar's smile faltered for a second. He hadn't expected to hear from her. "Feisty," he sneered. "I always liked that about you. But Dee's patience is wearing thin." "So is mine," Elias growled, and with that, he squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the morning air. It wasn't aimed to kill. It was a statement. It kicked up the dirt right in front of the lead rider's horse. The animal reared, screaming in panic, and then all hell broke loose. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire, splintering wood, and panicked shouts. The riders scattered, diving for cover behind a small rise in the land. Bullets tore through the walls of the house, punching holes in the plaster, shattering the last vestiges of their peaceful life. Elias fired again and again, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. He saw Cole, the sheriff's cousin, go down, clutching his arm, his shotgun falling into the dust. One down, two to go. Jed's rifle cracked from the barn, a steady, rhythmic report. He was pinning down the third man, keeping him from getting a clean shot at the house. That left the leader, the man with the scar. He was smart. He was using his dead horse as cover, firing methodically at the front window, trying to draw Elias's attention. Elias ducked as a bullet whizzed past his head, showering him with splinters. He knew it was a tactic, a distraction. But for what? Then he heard it, a scraping sound from the back of the house, followed by a loud crash. Clara. He sprinted through the house, his heart pounding in his chest. The back door had been splintered, kicked in from its hinges, and Clara was gone. A set of muddy footprints led out into the yard. She hadn't been taken. She had gone out to meet them. "Clara!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic. He ran outside, his revolver in his hand, expecting the worst. He saw the third man, the one Jed had been pinning down, lying on the ground, a knife in his back. Clara stood over him, her face grim, the bloody knife in her hand. But her eyes were fixed on the barn. The man with the scar had used Elias as a distraction to circle around and get to Jed. "Jed!" Elias yelled, running toward the barn. He heard a single gunshot from inside, a terrible final sound. He burst through the barn door just in time to see Jed slump to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The man with the scar stood over him, a smoking pistol in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Should have stayed out of it, blacksmith," he spat. He turned his pistol toward Elias. "Now about that book." He never finished the sentence. A shot rang out, not from Elias's gun, but from the barn loft above. The man with the scar looked down in stunned surprise at the new hole in his chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then crumpled to the ground. Elias looked up. Clara stood in the loft, the Winchester rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. Her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of an executioner. He rushed to Jed's side. The blacksmith was still breathing, but it was shallow, ragged. "Elias," he gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "The book. Get it to the Marshal, Fort Bridger." He didn't say another word. His eyes glazed over, and the last bit of life left him. Jedediah Kemp, the only honest man Elias knew, was dead. The silence that descended was heavier than any sound. The battle was over. They had won. But the cost was staggering. Elias knelt there in the dust and hay, his friend's blood on his hands, a cold, empty void opening up inside him. Clara climbed down from the loft, her movements stiff. She looked at Jed's body, then at the two other dead men outside. She didn't cry. Her grief was a cold, hard thing, buried too deep for tears. "It's not over," she said, her voice flat. "This was just his crew. D. Marlowe is still out there, and he will come." Elias stood up, his body aching, his soul weary. He looked at his wife, this woman of iron and fire, and knew she was right. This was just the beginning. They had won the battle, but the war for their lives, for their future, had just begun, and the biggest monster was yet to come. As he looked down at the dead man at his feet, the man with the scar, something glinted from inside his coat pocket. Elias reached down and pulled it out. It was a tarnished silver badge, a deputy's badge, issued by the St. Hollow Sheriff's Department. The truth hit him like a physical blow. These men weren't just being protected by the law. They were the law. The days following the shootout were a blur of grief and grim preparation. They buried Jed on a hill overlooking the ranch, next to the small, unmarked grave where Elias had once buried his son. Clara fashioned a simple wooden cross, carving his name into it with the same knife she'd used to kill one of his murderers. They stood there as the sun set, two solitary figures in a vast, indifferent landscape, the silence broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. There were no tears. Their sorrow had hardened into something else, something sharper and more dangerous. Resolve. They knew D. Marlowe was coming. It wasn't a question of if, but when, and they knew he wouldn't come alone. He would bring his entire force, and he would burn their world to the ground. The journal, the small leather-bound book that had cost so much blood, became their singular focus. Jed's dying words echoed in Elias's mind. Get it to the marshal. Fort Bridger. Fort Bridger was 100 miles away, 100 miles of open prairie, treacherous canyons, and unseen enemies. A journey that was tantamount to a suicide mission. They couldn't both go. The ranch, their home, couldn't be left undefended. I'll go, Elias said that night, as they sat by the fire cleaning their weapons. You stay here. Barricade the house. You can hold them off. Clara looked up from the rifle she was oiling, her eyes glinting in the firelight. No, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You don't know the trails. You don't know their ways. I do. I spent 3 years learning the whispers of those canyons, learning how to move without being seen. I can make it. He wanted to argue. The thought of her out there alone, hunted, terrified him more than facing D. Marlowe's entire gang himself. But he looked at her face, at the grim determination etched into every line, and he knew she was right. She wasn't the woman who needed protecting anymore. In many ways, she was stronger than he was. They'll be watching the main roads, she continued, her voice low and strategic. They'll expect me to run for the nearest town. They won't expect me to go north, through the Badlands. It's rough country, but I know a way they never showed me, a way I found on my own. A secret path to freedom she had been saving. The revelation sent a shiver down his spine. How many other secrets was she still holding? They spent the next day preparing. Clara dressed in a pair of Elias's old trousers and a durable shirt, her hair braided tightly back. She looked more like a hardened trail hand than the rancher's wife she had once been. She packed light, a canteen of water, a strip of dried beef, the journal wrapped in oilcloth, and a pistol with extra ammunition. As she was about to leave, Elias pressed his own revolver into her hand. Take this, he said. It's never failed me. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the 3 years of distance between them collapsed. He saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide, and she saw the agonizing worry in his own gaze. He reached out and pulled her into a fierce embrace, his hand tangling in her hair. Come back to me, Clara, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I always do, she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. And then she was gone, slipping out the back door and melting into the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost. Elias was left alone in the silent house, the weight of their world on his shoulders. His job was simple and impossible: to stay alive until she returned. He had to become the bait. He had to make D. Marlowe believe that both she and the journal were still here, inside the ranch house. He had to draw the monster into his trap. He spent the day making a show of it. He lit lamps in every room of the house that night, creating the illusion of multiple people. He fired off a few random shots into the darkness, as if testing his defenses. He sat on the porch, in plain sight, cleaning his rifle, making himself the perfect target. It was a deadly game of chess, and he was betting his life on Clara's ability to outrun the devil. 2 days passed. 2 days of gut-wrenching silence and sleepless nights. Every rustle of the wind sounded like approaching footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. He was a prisoner in his own home, the hunter waiting to be hunted. On the evening of the 3rd day they came. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was a slow, creeping siege. He saw them first as flickers of movement at the edge of his property, dark shapes darting between the trees. Then he heard a low whistle from the east, answered by another from the west. They were surrounding him, cutting off any chance of escape. Then a voice called out from the darkness, a voice that was both smooth and menacing, like whiskey laced with poison. Elias Boone, I know you're in there. I've come for what's mine, my girl, and my book. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, but I'm a forgiving man. Give them to me, and I'll make your death quick. D. Marlowe. The devil himself had come to his door. Elias's hand tightened on his rifle. He didn't answer. Let him wait. Let him wonder. The voice came again, closer this time. You know, your wife, she's a remarkable woman, full of surprises. Did she ever tell you how she escaped? She didn't just run. Oh no, she was far more clever than that. She set my men against each other, told one I was planning to kill him, told another his partner was stealing from him. She started a war inside my own camp, tore it apart from the inside out. It was beautiful in a way. Elias felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost choked him. Jed was right. He had underestimated her. But she made one mistake, Marlowe's voice continued, laced with a chilling amusement. She trusted the wrong man to help her get away. And that man, well, he told me everything. He told me her plan. He told me where she was going. The blood drained from Elias's face. No, it was a lie, a trick. I sent my best man after her 3 days ago, Marlowe said, his voice a triumphant purr. He knows the Badlands better than she does. By now, well, I imagine he's found her. So you see, you have nothing left to protect. Your stand is pointless. It's over. A cold, sickening dread washed over Elias. Had he sent her to her death? Had their one desperate gamble failed? For a moment his resolve wavered. The weight of his grief, his fear, his exhaustion pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. And then he heard it. A single gunshot, far off to the north, in the direction of the Badlands. It was followed by another, and then a third. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. A new voice, a woman's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the night. He's lying, Elias. I'm right here. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing on the ridge behind the house, silhouetted against the rising moon, was Clara. And she was not alone. She was surrounded by a dozen armed men. Men in uniform, U.S. Marshals. The game had changed. He wasn't the bait anymore. D. Marlowe was. Marlowe's confident laughter died in his throat. He had been so focused on the front of the house, so sure of his victory, that he had walked straight into a pincer. The hunters had become the hunted. It's over, Marlowe. A new voice boomed from the ridge, a voice of absolute authority. This is U.S. Marshal Franklin Thorne. Throw down your weapons. You are surrounded. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Marlowe let out a roar of pure, frustrated rage. It's never over, he screamed, and the night erupted into a storm of gunfire. But this wasn't a fair fight. Marlowe's men were caught in a crossfire, pinned down between the ranch house and the marshals on the ridge. Elias fired from the porch, no longer a cornered animal, but a righteous executioner. He saw men fall, their confident swagger dissolving into panicked screams. He saw D. Marlowe, his face contorted in a mask of fury, trying to rally his men. But it was no use. They were broken, scattered. Marlowe, realizing the battle was lost, made a run for the trees, for the darkness that had been his ally for so long. But he didn't get far. A single figure detached itself from the line of marshals on the ridge, moving with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was Clara. She ran down the slope, her rifle held steady, her eyes fixed on the man who had stolen 3 years of her life. Elias watched, his breath caught in his chest as she cornered him near the old oak tree by the creek. Marlowe turned, his pistol raised, but he was too slow. Clara was faster. She didn't shoot him. She slammed the butt of her rifle into his wrist, sending the gun flying. Then she brought the rifle up, pressing the barrel under his chin. They stood there for a long moment, face to face in the moonlight, the monster and his creation. He said something to her, his voice a low, desperate plea. She just shook her head, and then she pulled the trigger. The sound of the final shot echoed across the prairie, a punctuation mark at the end of a long and brutal sentence. It was over. It was finally, truly over. As the marshals rounded up the few remaining outlaws, Clara walked back toward the house. She stopped over the body of the man she had just killed, looked down at his face for a moment, then calmly spat on the ground beside him. She looked up and her eyes found Elias's across the yard. He walked to meet her, his legs feeling weak with relief. He didn't know what to say. Thank you felt too small. I love you felt inadequate. She stopped in front of him, her face smudged with dirt and gunpowder. He told me something, she said, her voice quiet. Just before the end, he said the journal you have, it's just a copy. The real one. The one with the names of the judges and politicians on his payroll. He said it's hidden, back at his main camp in Crooked Ridge. Elias stared at her, the triumphant elation of the last few minutes evaporating into a cold, hard realization. They had cut the head off the snake, but the body was still out there, twitching. Marshal Thorne strode up to them, a tall, imposing man with a grim face and weary eyes. Mrs. Boone, he said, his voice full of respect. You've done this country a great service. He turned to Elias. Your wife is the bravest woman I've ever met. I know, Elias said simply. This is far from over, Thorne continued, gesturing to the captured men. These are just the foot soldiers. Marlowe was part of a syndicate that has its tentacles wrapped all across this territory. The journal she brought us will help, but if there's another ledger, he let the sentence hang in the air. We're going to need help, local help, people who know the land, people who aren't afraid to fight, people like you two. It wasn't a request. It was a recruitment, a call to a new war. Ilias looked at Clara. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw a fire that could never be extinguished. She had been to hell and back, but she hadn't just survived. She had been reborn. She looked from the marshal to the dead outlaws, and then back to her husband. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first genuine smile he had seen in 3 years. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Well, she said, her voice laced with a weary, defiant humor, it's not like we have crops to plant. The long night was finally over. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky with the colors of a fresh start, of a new day, of a new fight. Their personal war had ended, but their story was just beginning. If you ever feel like the darkness is closing in, that the monsters are at your door, remember Elias and Clara Boone. They prove that even when you think you're alone, even when the law itself has turned against you, a single spark of defiance can be enough to set the whole rotten world on fire. If their story moved you, and you want to hear more tales of justice from the shadows, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what comes next.